The widow stood at the head of the table as if carved there, her hands resting on the dark wood, polished by generations of fear. The house breathed around her, slow, patient, listening. Outside, the fields lay stripped bare by winter, the soil worked by men who did not speak unless spoken to. Inside, her 6 daughters sat in a careful arc, grown women all, their faces bearing different versions of the same inheritance, sharp eyes, stubborn mouths. A beauty that felt more like a warning than a gift. She watched them the way a gardener studies diseased branches. Not with hatred, but with resolve. Blood, she had learned, was never sentimental. Blood was arithmetic. It multiplied or it failed. Her husband had believed in mercy. He had believed in love. The earth swallowed him quickly. The widow did not waste time on grief. She spent her nights reading the ledgers left behind. Records of births, deaths, strengths, weaknesses. Patterns emerged where others would see coincidence. The bloodline was thinning. Each generation softer than the last. Clever, yes, but fragile. A dynasty could not survive on cleverness alone. In the slave quarters, one man refused to break. He outworked the others without pride, endured punishment without pleading, and met suffering with a silence that unsettled even the overseers. Where others hardened into cruelty or collapsed into despair, he remained intact, as though something in him could not be bent. The widow noticed. She began to test him, not with kindness, but with impossible demands. Hunger, exhaustion, isolation. Each trial was meant to reveal a flaw. Each time, he endured, and each time, her certainty grew heavier, more dangerous. When she summoned her daughters again, the air changed. Candles burned low, though it was still daylight. No servants remained in the room. "You were born into a name," she told them, her voice calm, surgical. But a name means nothing without the strength to carry it forward. They understood then, not fully, but enough to feel the floor tilt beneath them. The house closed its doors. The fields fell silent, and somewhere deep in the widow's blood, something ancient stirred, pleased to be remembered. The widow inherited the estate the way one inherits a curse, without ceremony, without choice, and with the full weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, the moment the gates closed behind the mourners. The land had been in her husband's family for centuries, passed from father to son with the arrogance of something that believed itself eternal. Now it came to her stripped of that illusion, because tradition had never prepared itself for a woman who survived when the men did not. The house itself seemed to resent this disruption, its corridors echoing differently after the funeral, its walls whispering with a tension that had not existed before. She felt it immediately, that the estate was not merely property but a system, one that required a keeper strong enough to understand its rules rather than soften them. Her husband's death exposed more than grief. It exposed decay. The ledgers she found in his study were meticulous. Generations of records bound in cracked leather, births weighed against deaths, harvests against famines, marriages against failures. At first, she read them out of duty, believing knowledge itself to be a form of respect. But repetition sharpened her attention. Names reappeared beside the same weaknesses. Illnesses clustered along bloodlines. Once, renowned ancestors who had broken enemies with their hands were replaced, generation by generation, with men who relied on contracts, negotiations, and borrowed strength. The widow did not despise this evolution, but she recognized it as dangerous. Power that forgets how it was built becomes vulnerable to those who remember. The doctrine revealed itself gradually, not as a single declaration, but as a pattern hidden beneath mundane accounting. Marginal notes written by long, dead hands hinted at selective unions, strategic pairings disguised as romance or duty. Strength was measured, recorded, pursued. Blood was treated not as sacred, but as material. The widow understood then that what she had inherited was not just land, but an unfinished experiment. Her husband had abandoned it, whether out of moral exhaustion or fear she would never know. His mercy, she decided, had been a luxury afforded by stability. Stability no longer existed. The estate itself reflected this decline. Outbuildings sagged where they once stood straight. Stone walls crumbled where ancestors had enforced their borders with violence rather than words. The workers still obeyed, but obedience was thinner now, maintained by habit instead of awe. The widow walked the grounds in silence, observing how men moved when they thought no authority watched them. She noted hesitation where there should have been certainty, calculation where there should have been instinctive submission. This land had once shaped men. Now men were slowly reshaping it, and not in her favor. Her 6 daughters were scattered at the time of inheritance, living lives cushioned by the illusion that their birthright was permanent. They had been raised on stories of resilience and pride, without being taught the cost of either. When the widow summoned them home, she watched how they returned, some eager, some wary, some resentful at being pulled back into a place that felt too heavy with expectation. Each of them embodied a different failure and possibility of the bloodline. Intelligence without endurance. Beauty without discipline. Ambition without unity. They were impressive, but not formidable. That distinction mattered. The widow's belief that blood determined destiny was not mystical, though it frightened those who misunderstood it. To her, it was empirical. She saw lineage the way a smith sees metal impurities weaken the blade, no matter how elegant the design. She did not believe greatness was guaranteed by birth alone, only that birth set the boundaries within which greatness could or could not occur. The estate's doctrine had never promised virtue, only survival. And survival demanded choices others would refuse to make. What chilled even her own thoughts was how quickly resolve replaced doubt. There was no dramatic moment of decision, no lightning strike of revelation. Instead, certainty settled into her like cold, steady water. She told herself she was preserving something larger than herself, something her daughters would one day thank her for, if they lived long enough to understand it. Love, she reasoned, was irrelevant when weighed against extinction. A dying line could not afford sentimentality. As winter deepened, the widow closed parts of the estate, conserving resources, limiting movement, restoring hierarchies that had softened over time. She dismissed advisors who spoke of modern arrangements and hired overseers who understood fear as a language. Control returned slowly, not through cruelty alone, but through consistency. The land responded. Productivity rose. Silence thickened. The estate began to feel awake again, as though it recognized a familiar hand on its reins. By the time spring approached, the widow no longer questioned her inheritance or the doctrine it carried. She had accepted that she was not merely a caretaker of land, but a custodian of intention. The past had entrusted her with a truth few were willing to face, that bloodlines, like empires, do not collapse from external threats alone, but from internal weakness left unchallenged. And weakness, once tolerated, becomes tradition if allowed to persist. The return of the daughters was not announced by fanfare or warmth, but by disruption, the subtle fracture of routines the estate had only just begun to reclaim. One by one they arrived through the iron gates, carriages bearing marks of distant cities, different climates, different compromises. The widow watched from the upper windows as each daughter stepped onto the gravel, noting posture before expression, silence before speech. These were not children coming home. They were adults shaped elsewhere, carrying lives that had not required this land or its rules, and that independence unsettled the house more than rebellion ever could. The eldest arrived first, composed and distant, her movements economical as though emotion were an indulgence she had learned to ration. She had made her way through salons and councils, trading charm for influence, believing the world could be bent with words alone. Her gaze lingered on the estate with faint disappointment, as if it were an old weapon rendered obsolete by modern hands. She believed strength could be negotiated. The widow recognized this as a dangerous misunderstanding. The second came laughing, her voice filling the courtyard before her feet touched the ground. She wore confidence like armor, dazzling and brittle, masking an impatience with limits. Life had rewarded her beauty and audacity, and she had mistaken reward for invincibility. The widow saw how servants' eyes followed her, and how easily that attention could become leverage or resentment. Charm, left undisciplined, was a spark near dry grain. The third returned quietly, eyes always moving, absorbing details no one else noticed. She had learned caution early, watching rather than acting, surviving by avoiding attention. There was intelligence there, sharp and adaptable, but also a reluctance to stand fully in the open. The widow wondered how long such a mind could endure pressure before folding inward, consuming itself rather than confronting what threatened it. The fourth daughter arrived late, unannounced, having dismissed her escort miles away. She carried herself with defiance, as though daring the land to challenge her presence. She had tasted rebellion and found it intoxicating, believing resistance itself was proof of strength. The widow saw in her a fire that could either harden into resolve or burn uncontrollably, taking everything with it. Fire without purpose was just another kind of ruin. The fifth brought resentment like a shadow. Her eyes lingered on the house with accusation, as if it had personally betrayed her by existing. She had lived under the weight of expectations. She neither chose nor escaped, and bitterness had become her companion. The widow understood bitterness well. Left unchecked, it could sharpen into cruelty or corrode into despair. Neither outcome served survival. The youngest returned last, hesitant, as though crossing the threshold required permission she did not believe she possessed. She had lived carefully, shrinking herself to fit into spaces that never truly welcomed her. There was kindness in her, and a yearning to be seen, to be chosen. The widow felt no comfort in this. Kindness, she believed, was the first casualty of hard times, and those who relied on it often did not survive to learn why. When they gathered under one roof, the estate felt suddenly crowded, its long corridors echoing with unfamiliar rhythms. The daughters spoke in fragments, overlapping conversations that revealed how far apart they had grown. Old rivalries surfaced disguised as jokes. Alliances formed quickly, then fractured just as fast. Each daughter believed she understood the others, but none of them understood the house they had returned to, or the woman who now ruled it. The widow observed without intervening. She watched how they took their meals, who sat closest to whom, who avoided eye contact, who filled silence with noise. These details mattered more than declarations. Power always revealed itself in small, unguarded moments. She noted which daughters still expected indulgence, which anticipated conflict, and which feared it. Their adulthood did not equal readiness. It only meant their weaknesses were now ingrained. What unsettled her most was not their defiance, but their assumptions. They assumed inheritance was a shield, that the estate would always protect them simply because it bore their name. They assumed their mother's authority was temporary, softened by affection or fatigue. None of them yet grasped that the widow no longer saw them as extensions of herself, but as components of a larger equation. Love had not vanished, but it had been reordered, placed beneath necessity. The house seemed to listen as they spoke late into the night, doors half closed, secrets exchanged in tones meant to exclude authority. The widow allowed it. Let them believe privacy still existed here. Let them cling to the illusion that adulthood meant autonomy within these walls. Control, she knew, was most effective when it appeared unnecessary. By the end of the first week, tension had settled like dust on every surface. The daughters sensed change, but could not yet name it. They felt watched, weighed, measured against something they did not understand. The estate, once a symbol of origin, now felt like a question posed directly to them, demanding an answer none of them were prepared to give, and the widow, standing at the center of it all, understood that their return was not a reunion, but the convergence of fault lines that had been spreading for years, now pressing against one another under the same roof. Waiting for pressure to turn into fracture, the revelation did not come as an announcement, but as an inevitability. The way storms gather without warning those beneath them, until the air itself becomes heavy. The widow did not summon her daughters immediately. She allowed the tension to mature, to press inward on them, until each began to feel isolated, even in shared rooms. Only when their confidence had thinned did she call them together. Not to the formal dining hall, but to the smaller chamber once used for family council, where the walls were close and the past felt uncomfortably near. She stood while they sat. That alone unsettled them. Their mother had always preferred balanced conversation, the appearance of unity. Now she placed herself apart, not elevated, but unmistakably separate. The candles were few. Shadows claimed more of the room than light did. She spoke without preamble. "Our line is failing." The words were simple, delivered without anger or accusation, and that made them more dangerous. The daughters reacted differently, exactly as the widow expected. Disbelief flickered across one face. Offense hardened another. One laughed softly, assuming exaggeration. Another stiffened, already defensive, already preparing to argue. The widow let their reactions play out, studying them as though they were evidence confirming her claim. She told them what she had seen in the records, what repetition revealed when sentiment was stripped away. Strength had narrowed. Resilience had eroded. Where ancestors had survived famine, war, and betrayal, recent generations struggled against inconvenience and uncertainty. Intelligence had increased, yes, but intelligence without endurance was fragile. Beauty had refined, but beauty did not withstand pressure. The widow did not insult them. She dissected them, placing each quality into its proper category, measuring value against survival. They objected, of course. They spoke of progress, of a world that no longer demanded brutality to endure. They spoke of alliances, institutions, protections their ancestors could not have imagined. The widow listened, patient, unmoved. She reminded them that every system they trusted was built by hands stronger than theirs, and that systems collapsed the moment those hands weakened. History, she said, was not a straight line forward, but a cycle that punished complacency without mercy. Then she said the thing that silenced them. Blood remembers what we try to forget. She did not mean it mystically, though it sounded that way. She explained it as inheritance, as limits written into flesh long before choices were made. You could train the mind, refine manners, teach strategy, but you could not teach the body to endure what it was not built to endure. You could not negotiate with weakness once it was tested. The widow spoke of bloodlines the way a physician spoke of disease, with clarity stripped of comfort. They began to understand then that this was not a conversation. It was a diagnosis. The youngest asked if this was punishment, if their mother blamed them for something beyond their control. The widow answered honestly. Blame was irrelevant. Responsibility was not. They had been born into a lineage that demanded something from them. Whether they accepted it or not, the world would not excuse them simply because the demands felt unfair. Blood did not care about fairness. Another daughter accused her of cruelty, of reducing them to components rather than people. The widow did not deny it. People, she said, were temporary. Lines endured only when individuals accepted their role in preserving them. The moment personal desire outweighed collective survival, collapse began. She reminded them that their comfort existed because countless predecessors had chosen duty over inclination, often at terrible cost. When one daughter suggested adaptation rather than correction, the widow's gaze sharpened. Adaptation, she said, required material worth adapting. You could not refine what had already thinned beyond strength. Correction was not destruction. It was preservation through difficult means. She did not elaborate further, and the absence of detail frightened them more than explanation would have. The room felt smaller as realization spread. This was not about inheritance or authority alone. It was about purpose being imposed where autonomy had once existed. The daughters sensed the narrowing of possibility, the subtle closing of doors they had assumed would remain open. They were adults, yes, but adulthood did not grant immunity from being claimed by something larger. The widow watched fear surface in layers. Fear of losing choice. Fear of being measured and found wanting. Fear that love itself might be conditional. She did not soften her stance to relieve them. Fear, she believed, was clarifying. It stripped away illusions and revealed what remained when comfort vanished. She told them that correction was already underway, that inaction was no longer an option. The estate could not wait for consensus. Blood did not pause for debate. She had accepted the burden they now resisted, and history would not forgive hesitation. Whether they participated willingly or not was secondary. Survival did not require consent. When the meeting ended, she dismissed them without ceremony. No reassurance followed, no explanation of what correction meant or how far it would go. The daughters left the chamber changed, carrying the weight of an unnamed future pressing against their backs. The widow remained alone, listening to the house settle around her, knowing that the moment of revelation was not the beginning of conflict but the end of denial, and that once a line accepted it was failing. The only question left was how much it was willing to sacrifice to endure among the laborers bound to the estate. Strength had always been measured crudely, by the weight a man could lift, or the hours he could endure before his body failed him. The widow changed that measure without announcing it, the way she changed most things, through quiet adjustments that revealed more than proclamations ever could. Workloads shifted. Tasks grew deliberately inefficient, designed not to be completed quickly but to erode patience, coordination, and will. Men were paired against the land rather than each other, set to dig where the soil resisted, to rebuild walls the frost would undo by morning, to haul stone along paths that punished the careless. Complaints were met with silence. Those who learned to conserve effort, rather than waste it, survived longer. It was in this slow narrowing that one man distinguished himself, not by speed or bravado, but by an economy of movement that suggested thought under strain. He listened more than he spoke. He adjusted when conditions changed instead of insisting on routine. When others argued over fairness, he accepted the task and completed it as though fairness were irrelevant. The overseers noticed first, irritated by how little leverage they seemed to have over him. Threats did not hurry him. Rewards did not soften him. He worked as if work were not a negotiation but a fact, and facts did not care how one felt about them. The widow noticed next, though she did not look for him intentionally. She noticed patterns before people. A section of wall that never needed repairing again. A team that completed its work without incident when he was present. Fewer injuries. Fewer excuses. She asked questions without asking them, comparing records, tracing outcomes back through names. His appeared with a frequency that defied coincidence. She ordered new trials quietly, designed to isolate variables rather than test endurance alone. The man was moved between crews, stripped of familiarity, denied the small advantages of routine. Where others faltered under constant change, he adapted, absorbing new rhythms without complaint. He did not dominate the men around him, nor did he submit to them. He existed among them without friction, which was rarer than strength and more dangerous. When illness swept through the quarters, he did not avoid it, nor did he succumb. He took on the work of those who fell ill without spectacle, distributing effort, so no one collapsed entirely. The widow watched from a distance as productivity held steady despite losses. This was not luck. This was management under pressure, instinctive and untrained. She ordered punishment next, not for him, but near him. Arbitrary enforcement had always been a useful tool, revealing how men responded when logic failed. Some raged, some broke, some withdrew into themselves. The man did none of these things. He absorbed the injustice without internalizing it, neither justifying it nor rebelling against it. He adjusted his expectations downward and continued. The widow understood then that his strength was not rooted in hope. Hope could be crushed. His strength came from acceptance, and acceptance was difficult to weaponize against its bearer. This realization unsettled her more than admiration would have. She had seen strong men before, men who believed themselves invincible until the right pressure revealed how fragile they truly were. This one did not believe in invincibility. He believed in continuation. When one method failed, he found another. When strength waned, he relied on precision. When authority pressed down, he did not waste energy resisting it in ways that achieved nothing. She summoned him once, not to test him further, but to observe him under direct scrutiny. The room was spare, no witnesses, no threats. She asked simple questions that carried no obvious consequence. He answered plainly, without flattery or fear, measuring his words as though excess were a liability. When she dismissed him, he did not linger, nor did he rush to leave. He exited as he entered, fully present, fully contained. Fixation followed not as desire, but as recognition. The widow did not see him as a man in the way others might. She saw him as proof. Proof that endurance still existed in its unrefined form. Proof that something unsoftened could survive prolonged pressure without becoming monstrous or broken. She compared him mentally to the men in her bloodline's records, the ones who had built walls and buried enemies, who had endured winters without complaint and loss without collapse. The resemblance was not physical alone. It was structural. She increased the trials again, aware that attention itself could corrupt what it touched. Privilege weakens what struggle tempers. She ensured he received neither. Others were pushed to compete with him, to resent him, to test him socially as well as physically. He did not rise to provocation. When confronted, he de-escalated. When isolated, he endured. When praised by his peers, he redirected credit. Leadership, she noted, without ambition. The estate seemed to respond to him as well. Areas he worked stabilized. Conflicts diminished. Efficiency improved without brutality. The widow did not believe in coincidence. She believed in convergence, the moment when separate variables aligned into something undeniable. By the time she accepted what he represented, she also accepted the danger of that knowledge. Recognition invited use. Use invited destruction. Yet ignoring him would have been dishonest, and dishonesty was the one weakness she would not permit herself. The bloodline doctrine did not demand comfort. It demanded acknowledgement of reality as it existed, not as one wished it to be. So she watched him continue, testing not how much he could endure, but how consistently he remained himself while enduring it, how little he eroded under conditions designed to erode everything, and how, in surviving without spectacle, he had already crossed an invisible threshold from laborer to something far more consequential within the silent calculations of the widow's desire. The understanding did not arrive all at once. It seeped in gradually through contradictions that refused to resolve themselves and silences that felt deliberate rather than accidental. At first, the daughters noticed it in the language their mother used, how she no longer spoke of inheritance as something to be divided, but as something to be continued. Words like legacy and future replaced terms like ownership and succession. It was subtle enough to dismiss as philosophy until patterns emerged that made dismissal impossible. Decisions were made without consulting them. Not small ones, but structural ones. The kind that reshaped the estate's future while rendering their opinions irrelevant. Holdings were consolidated rather than apportioned. Titles were left deliberately undefined. The daughters assumed delay bureaucracy, some strategic patience on their mother's part. What unsettled them was not the absence of answers, but the absence of concern over their expectations. They began to feel misaligned with the house itself. Rooms that once felt assigned now felt temporary. Personal belongings were catalogued with a thoroughness that suggested preservation rather than use. Servants responded to their requests with politeness, stripped of deference, as though the daughter's authority had been downgraded without formal notice. Power had not been taken from them openly. It had simply stopped acknowledging them. The realization sharpened during a meeting meant to discuss succession, a topic the daughters approached with varying degrees of confidence and anxiety. They arrived prepared to negotiate, to argue, to defend their individual claims. The widow listened, allowing each to speak, to frame herself as essential, as deserving, as irreplaceable. When they finished, she regarded them with an expression not of disappointment, but of assessment. The way one looks at tools laid out on a table. "You are thinking vertically," she told them, "as though the line ends with you." The words landed unevenly. Some bristled. Some leaned forward, searching for reassurance hidden in explanation. None of them yet understood what she meant, and that ignorance unsettled them more than disagreement would have. The widow continued calmly, explaining that inheritance was not a reward, but a function. A line did not exist to elevate individuals. Individuals existed to ensure the line did not break. One of them protested, speaking of rights, of the sacrifices they had made, of lives shaped by the assumption that they would one day command this estate. The widow did not contradict her. She simply removed the assumption from the equation. Command, she said, was secondary. Continuity was primary. The estate did not need rulers. It needed persistence. That was when the word vessel first appeared, though not spoken aloud. It emerged in the daughters' minds as a shared thought they did not yet dare to voice. They felt it in how their mother's gaze lingered, not on their accomplishments but on their potential, not on what they had achieved, but on what they could still produce. The shift was unmistakable. Their value was no longer retrospective. It was prospective. They argued then, more urgently, accusing her of erasing them, of reducing their existence to function rather than identity. The widow did not deny this either. Identity, she said, was a luxury afforded by stable times. When survival was uncertain, function became truth. The daughters realized with growing dread that their mother was not improvising. She was executing a framework older than any of them. One that measured worth by outcome rather than intention. What frightened them most was not the implication itself, but how easily it made sense within the logic she had already established. Blood as material, strength as continuity, weakness as dilution. Within that structure, hairs were distractions, vessels were solutions. The daughters felt themselves repositioned within a design that did not require their consent to proceed. They searched for exceptions, for proof that this logic could not apply equally to all of them. Surely one would be chosen to lead, to inherit outright, to escape reduction. The widow did not offer reassurance. She spoke instead of redundancy, of resilience through multiplicity, of systems designed to survive loss. No single point of failure, she said. No irreplaceable component. The youngest asked if love still had a place in this design. The question lingered in the air longer than the others had. The widow answered carefully. Love, she said, was not absent. It was simply no longer indulgent. Love could not justify extinction. Love could not protect a line from collapse. If anything, love demanded harder choices, because it recognized what was at stake. The daughters left that meeting changed in ways that could not be undone. They felt hollowed out, not because something had been taken from them, but because something they believed had never truly belonged to them in the first place. Their futures, once imagined as expansive and self-directed, now felt narrowed into channels whose shape they had not chosen. The house seemed closer, its walls more attentive, as though it too understood their reclassification. In private, they spoke of escape, of refusal, of resistance. But those conversations lacked conviction. The estate was not merely a place. It was infrastructure, history, consequence. To leave it behind would require shedding more than proximity. It would require abandoning a lineage that had already begun to claim them in ways they could not yet fully articulate. What haunted them in the quiet hours was not the fear of being used, but the fear that their mother might be right, that their lives had always been moving toward this role, regardless of intention, and that what they mistook for inheritance had never been power at all, but preparation for a function they were only now beginning to recognize as their own within a design that no longer asked who they wanted to be, only what they could carry forward into a future that had already been decided in principle, if not yet in form. The realization came to him slowly, not as fear but as a distortion of relief. Survival had always been his measure of success. Each day endured was a victory. Each night reached intact was proof that he had done something right. He had learned early that hope was dangerous, but continuation was attainable. What unsettled him now was that continuation had begun to feel curated rather than earned, as though the forces that had once sought to crush him were instead shaping the space around him to ensure he remained intact. At first, he welcomed the change without examining it. The work still came, heavy and unyielding, but the randomness had thinned. He was moved deliberately rather than arbitrarily. Tasks that once seemed designed to break men outright now tested precision, judgment, restraint. He noticed that failure no longer brought immediate punishment, only recalibration. Mistakes were observed, not exploited. This was new, and novelty bred caution. The men around him changed as well. Some were reassigned away from him. Others were brought closer, men whose tempers ran hot, whose desperation made them unpredictable. Conflict was inevitable, but it never escalated beyond a certain point. Overseers intervened before violence could become irreversible. He understood then that disorder was being managed, not allowed. Someone wanted him functioning, not merely surviving. The first true fracture in his understanding came when he was spared something he should not have been. A task went unfinished through no fault of his own. In the past, this would have invited punishment severe enough to discourage explanation. Instead, The consequence fell elsewhere, diffuse and impersonal. He felt the absence like a weight lifted too cleanly, leaving behind suspicion rather than gratitude. Mercy, when unearned, was never free. He began to observe himself as though from a distance, measuring his own presence the way he had learned to measure environments. Eyes followed him more often now, not with hostility but with intent. Conversations stopped when he approached, not out of fear but out of caution. He was no longer invisible, and invisibility had been one of his last defenses. The summons came without warning. No explanation, no escort heavy with threat. Just an instruction delivered neutrally, as though his compliance were assumed. He considered refusal briefly, not because he believed it would succeed, but because it was important to remember that refusal existed as a concept. He dismissed it and went, understanding that resistance without leverage was not strength but waste. The meeting itself was disarming in its simplicity. No accusations, no tests, no overt demands. The widow spoke to him as one might speak to a resource that had finally revealed its true properties. She asked about his work, his methods, his tolerance for uncertainty. Her questions were not traps. They were calibrations. He answered honestly, because honesty had always cost him less than performance. It was only afterward, alone again, that comprehension began to form. He replayed the encounter, noting what had not been asked. Nothing about loyalty. Nothing about ambition. Nothing about escape. These omissions were deliberate. They suggested that his desires were irrelevant to the role being shaped around him. Survival, he realized, had not marked him as expendable. It had marked him as usable. This understanding did not provoke panic. Panic required a belief that escape might still be possible. What he felt instead was a tightening, the sensation of corridors narrowing ahead of him, while the space behind closed without sound. The estate no longer tested whether he would break. It tested how predictably he would hold. He thought of the men who had not survived, the ones who had burned out quickly, loudly, leaving nothing behind but memory and warning. He had believed himself wiser for enduring. Now he understood the cost of that wisdom. Those men had been consumed. He was being preserved. Preservation, he learned, was not protection. It was investment. Privileges appeared disguised as efficiencies. He was given better tools, not comforts. He was allowed rest, not freedom. His body was monitored with a precision that felt intimate without being personal. Injury was treated promptly, pain managed just enough to keep him functional. He was no longer allowed to fail catastrophically. Failure had become too expensive. The most disturbing realization was how little he was asked to do differently. He was not forced into obedience through overt control. He was allowed to remain himself. That constancy, once his shield, had become the justification for his continued use. Change would have been resistance. Stability was compliance. He considered self-sabotage, the quiet erosion of usefulness that might return him to obscurity. But even this felt anticipated. Tasks were diversified. Redundancy was minimized around him but maximized elsewhere. His absence would be noticed now. Not emotionally, but structurally. He had become a point of reference, and points of reference were difficult to erase without consequence. What weighed on him most was the absence of cruelty. Cruelty would have simplified things. Cruelty invited hatred, and hatred clarified opposition. This was different. This was calm, methodical, convinced of its own necessity. It did not need his suffering. It needed his continuation. He understood then that survival was no longer neutral. To endure within this system was to participate in it, whether he consented or not. Each day he remained intact strengthened the design that required him intact. Refusal would have required an earlier death, one he had already outlived. The estate had not chosen him because he was strong, It had chosen him because he endured without deforming into something unusable. And endurance, when captured and contained, was more valuable than strength that burned itself out quickly. And in recognizing this, he finally understood that his greatest victory had quietly transformed into his sentence. One measured not in chains or commands, but in the terrible clarity that survival itself had become the mechanism by which his future was no longer his to shape. The first sign of resistance did not announce itself as rebellion. It appeared as curiosity sharpened by fear, the kind that refuses to stay dormant once awakened. One daughter, more observant than the others, began to notice how decisions aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. Schedules shifted just enough to intersect. Conversations ended just before certain names were spoken. Resources moved quietly from one place to another, never wasted, never misplaced, always ending up where pressure was greatest. The design was there if one knew how to look for it, and once seen, it could not be unseen. She did not confront her mother. Confrontation required leverage, and she had none. Instead, she watched. She listened from corridors where sound carried. She learned which servants still feared the widow, and which feared the house itself more. Fear, she discovered, was layered, and each layer answered to a different authority. The estate functioned not through chaos, but through alignment, and alignment could be disrupted without ever being named. Her sisters were too loud in their distress or too quiet in their denial to notice what she noticed. One raged openly, exhausting herself against walls that did not respond. Another retreated inward, hoping invisibility might still offer refuge. The one who plotted understood that noise attracted correction, and correction refined the system rather than weakening it. To threaten the plan, she would need to introduce uncertainty, not opposition. She began with small deviations. A message delivered late. A task misunderstood just enough to require repetition. Supplies redirected under the pretense of efficiency. Each action alone was meaningless. Together, they created friction where smooth execution had been expected. The estate adjusted, of course. It always did. But adjustment took time, and time created gaps. Her greatest risk was knowledge. She had learned enough to know that the plan depended on balance, on precision maintained across many moving parts. The widow did not rule through force alone. She ruled through inevitability, by making outcomes feel preordained. To challenge inevitability, one had to reintroduce chance. She sought allies carefully, not among those who hated the widow openly, but among those who still believed in alternatives. Belief was fragile, but it was also unpredictable. She spoke in hypotheticals, never accusations. What if this estate could survive through adaptation rather than correction? What if strength could be cultivated rather than sourced? What if preservation did not require reduction? Some listened, some did not. She accepted both outcomes as data rather than failure. The most dangerous step was interfering with observation. The widow's power relied on seeing patterns clearly, on tracing outcomes back to cause without obstruction. The daughter introduced noise into that clarity. Records were copied imperfectly. Metrics overlapped where they should not have. Correlations blurred. It was subtle enough to appear as human error, which made it difficult to isolate without revealing how closely everything was being watched. The risk of discovery grew daily. The estate responded to inefficiency the way a body responded to infection, with focused pressure. Overseers questioned routines. Servants were reshuffled. The daughter felt the net tightening, not around her specifically, but around the possibility of deviation itself. She understood then that she was not merely threatening a plan. She was threatening control, and control did not tolerate ambiguity for long. What she did not anticipate was the effect her actions would have on her sisters. The disruption created opportunities they did not fully understand, but instinctively used. One sister delayed compliance just long enough to force negotiation. Another withheld information that would once have been surrendered without thought. These were not coordinated acts, but they resonated like vibrations finding a shared frequency. The system began to strain not because it was broken, but because it was being asked to compensate too often, too quickly. The daughter who plotted felt both triumph and terror. Triumph, because the plan was not as absolute as it pretended to be. Terror, because the cost of failure was not limited to herself. She had introduced instability into a structure designed to punish instability ruthlessly. If the widow traced the disruption back to its source, correction would not be surgical. It would be decisive. The moment of near discovery came without drama. A question asked too precisely. A pause held too long. The daughter felt the weight of attention settle on her, not accusing, but assessing. She responded with truth carefully arranged to obscure rather than reveal, offering enough to satisfy curiosity without exposing intent. The widow accepted the answer, but acceptance did not equal dismissal. It meant the variable had been logged. From that moment on, the daughter understood that sabotage could not be sustained indefinitely. The system would adapt or eliminate. There was no middle ground. She needed something larger than friction, something that could not be smoothed out through recalibration. She needed an event, not an error. Her thoughts turned toward the one element the plan relied on most heavily, yet treated as stable. Stability, she knew, was always an assumption, never a guarantee. If she could unsettle that assumption, even briefly, the balance her mother depended on would fracture long enough to expose the cost of control. The estate slept that night under a tension it did not yet recognize as danger. The daughter lay awake, understanding that whatever she set in motion next would not be reversible, that resistance, once escalated, could not return to subtlety, and that by choosing to act she was no longer seeking escape alone, but forcing a reckoning between inevitability and choice. One that would demand a response from a system unaccustomed to being challenged at its foundation and prepared to defend itself with whatever severity it deemed necessary, even if that defense required sacrifices the widow had not yet admitted she was willing to make. The state closed in on itself, not through force, but through repetition. Doors remained open, yet fewer people passed through them. Corridors stayed lit, but conversations dimmed. Schedules tightened until every movement felt anticipated, and anticipation bred silence. What had once been a sprawling household became a contained system, its inhabitants orbiting one another with careful distance, each aware that proximity carried risk and isolation carried consequence. Paranoia did not arrive as panic. It arrived as calculation. Servants learned to measure their words not by honesty, but by survivability. Overseers stopped enforcing rules with visible cruelty and began enforcing them with consistency, which was far more effective. Deviations were corrected quickly, without spectacle, and the lack of spectacle made resistance feel pointless. The estate did not threaten. It adjusted, and adjustment proved harder to fight than punishment. The daughters felt the shift acutely. Meals became quieter. Not because conversation was forbidden, but because each comment felt as though it might be weighed later. Glances lingered too long, or not long enough. Alliances that once felt natural now required maintenance, reassurance, proof of shared intent. Trust, once eroded, did not collapse dramatically. It thinned, stretched, became brittle. Rituals emerged without being declared rituals. Morning inspections, evening reports, weekly reviews of productivity, health, compliance. None of these were new in isolation, but their accumulation created rhythm, and rhythm created expectation. Expectation created obedience that did not feel imposed, only necessary. Those who resisted rhythm stood out immediately, and standing out invited attention. The widow rarely appeared during these routines. Her absence was deliberate. Authority, when omnipresent, became familiar. Familiarity softened fear. Instead, she allowed the system to speak for her, to carry her intention into every corner of the estate without requiring her voice. When she did appear, it was briefly, precisely, enough to remind everyone that the system had an author. Silence became the most valuable currency. Speaking less reduced exposure. Listening more increased survival. The daughters adapted unevenly. One spoke too often, attempting to dominate space with volume, mistaking noise for control. Another withdrew entirely, hoping invisibility might still offer refuge. The others learned to speak just enough to maintain relevance without revealing strategy, a delicate balance that demanded constant vigilance. The slave quarters changed as well. Men who once shared burdens began guarding information. Cooperation remained, but it was narrower, transactional. Loyalty shifted away from individuals and toward predictability. Those who behaved consistently were trusted, more than those who promised solidarity. Survival favored the predictable, and predictability favored obedience. Obedience, however, did not erase resentment. It buried it. Beneath the smooth operation of the estate, tension coiled, compressed by routine and silence. Small acts of defiance still occurred, but they were private, internal, expressed through thoughts rather than action. The system did not need to eliminate rebellion entirely. It only needed to make expression too costly to justify. Ritualized obedience became the language of the household. People stood when expected. They waited when told. They complied without being asked twice. The ritual itself mattered more than the outcome. By performing obedience regularly, inhabitants internalized it until the boundary between choice and habit blurred. When obedience became habit, resistance required conscious effort, and conscious effort was exhausting. The plotting daughter felt this exhaustion keenly. Each deviation now required layers of camouflage. Each attempt to introduce uncertainty risked immediate absorption by the system's corrective mechanisms. The estate had learned from her earlier disruptions. It had become more vigilant, more precise. Where once it compensated broadly, now it targeted narrowly, isolating anomalies before they could propagate. What frightened her most was how normal it all began to feel. Days passed without incident. Productivity increased. Conflict decreased. The estate functioned better than it had in years. From the outside, it might have appeared successful, even admirable. Stability returned, but it was a stability built on suppression rather than resolution. The daughters sensed that any overt challenge now would not fracture the system, but justify its escalation. Control could always be tightened further. The estate was designed to withstand pressure, not accommodate dissent. To push against it directly would be to strengthen it, to prove the necessity of its harshest measures. The chosen man felt the change differently. Where others felt watched, he felt contained. His routines narrowed further, his interactions limited to those deemed efficient. He was insulated from chaos not as protection, but as preservation. The system guarded him carefully, reducing variables that might disrupt his function. He understood that the calm around him was artificial, maintained at the cost of pressure applied elsewhere. At night, the estate seemed to listen to itself. Footsteps echoed too clearly. Doors closed with finality. Even the wind felt measured, as though it passed through the grounds under instruction. Those who lay awake sensed that they were no longer merely living within the house, but sustaining it through their compliance. Paranoia reached its peak not when fear spiked, but when fear stabilized. When everyone assumed they were being observed, Observation no longer needed to be constant. The possibility was enough. Silence became self-enforcing. Order perpetuated itself. In this closed system, obedience was no longer negotiated. It was ritualized, rehearsed daily until deviation felt unnatural, until the idea of acting freely seemed reckless rather than brave, and the estate, functioning smoothly under the weight of unspoken rules, prepared itself for the next phase of the widow's design, confident that resistance had been reduced not through force alone, but through the slow, methodical conversion of fear into habit. The widow stood alone in the upper gallery as the estate moved beneath her in perfect alignment. Reports came without urgency. Corrections were enacted before she needed to ask. The system no longer strained against itself. It had learned the shape of her will and molded itself accordingly. What remained of resistance had narrowed into isolated thoughts, harmless without momentum. The daughter who had plotted understood first that the window had closed. Instability no longer spread. It was absorbed, redirected, neutralized. The event she had once believed necessary would now only serve as proof that escalation was justified. Choice still existed in theory, but not in practice. To act now would be to sacrifice others without changing the outcome. She chose silence. Not because she believed in the design, but because she recognized when history had already committed itself. The other daughters adjusted in their own ways. One hardened, reshaping herself into something functional, abandoning protest in favor of relevance. Another faded inward, becoming efficient, agreeable, forgettable. One learned to perform conviction she did not feel, mistaking endurance for strength. None of them escaped their redefinition. The house did not need them to believe. It only needed them to continue. The man endured as he always had, but endurance no longer belonged to him alone. It had been folded into the estate's future, abstracted into purpose. He understood now that his survival had meaning only insofar as it served something that would outlast him. There was no hatred in this realization, only a cold clarity. His body was no longer his boundary. It was infrastructure. The widow felt no triumph. Triumph implied doubt overcome. She felt resolution. The bloodline doctrine no longer troubled her sleep, because it no longer required justification. It was operational. Whatever history might call her, history would also remember that the line did not end with her generation. On the night the final measures were set into motion, the estate was silent in a way it had never been before. Not tense, not fearful, simply complete. The walls held their breath. The land waited. The widow placed her hand against the stone balustrade, feeling the steadiness she had restored at terrible cost. She thought of the past, of futures that would never know her name, only the continuity she had enforced. Love had not guided her. Necessity had, and necessity, once answered, did not look back.